Life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory, and the glory of the Father, and of the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God.
This morning I want to talk about bearing our cross. The passage there in Luke 9:23 is our theme verse for this quarter, and would have liked to have gotten to it last week, the beginning of the quarter, but kind of the Holy Spirit lessons bled over a little bit. I want to talk a bit about that idea of, I was looking at all the different passages where he told his disciples and the crowds that they needed to pick up the cross. And I've wondered, did they really know what that meant when they first heard it? Because they didn't think he was going to a cross. They didn't think he was going to die. So why would they have really understood, how would they have understood it, that they were following him using the cross? Now, a lot of the passages where he said it, he came right after telling them and reminding them that he was going to die. But when he died, they were still shocked. So they hadn't really picked up on all of the clues that they had been given, all of the times they had been told. In fact, I learned this week that I, shockingly, repeat myself a lot when it comes to instruction. And I was thinking a lot about that, the concept of why do we repeat ourselves, and think about, as kids, you probably know, even the littlest kids probably know something your parents have told you over and over again, right? You know, they tell you this, you got to do this, brush your teeth. How often why don't you just tell your kids one time, okay, in the morning you brush your teeth, and then in the evening before you go to bed you brush your teeth? Why don't we just tell them once? Because they don't remember. They don't do it. So you keep reminding them. And instructions, I was thinking about Jesus when it comes to this idea of how often we get instructed, that Jesus told them over and over again. Now there's a lot of theologians that think the synoptic gospels, they call that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Gospels are all similar to each other. And that some think they just kind of copied from each other. And in fact, in Matthew chapter 5 begins one of Jesus' most famous sermons called the Sermon on the Mount. It's titled. Don't know how big the mount is. Could be a little molehill. We don't actually know how many people are around him because he actually left the crowd and his disciples followed him. So we don't know how many disciples are around him. So a lot of times our images of it are not really completely accurate. But in that, he instructed them about a whole bunch of stuff. Well, then you come to Luke, and we have almost the same sermon, a little condensed, few little things left out, but it's the Sermon on the Plain. And a lot of it, we don't think about that. And so a lot of theologians, they go, well, they just kind of copied it and reset it in a different situation. Do you think for 3 years Jesus didn't repeat himself? He traveled over an area about the size of the Treasure Valley, speaking to lots of different groups of people. How many times do you think he taught almost everything he taught? I bet a bunch. And how many times did it take for his disciples, not just the crowds, how many times did it take his disciples to really get it? Really, for most of his disciples, it took after he raised from the dead till he could explain it after he had come back from being killed. Before they went, oh, that's what you meant. Because that's why we get instructed a lot. As kids, you've told me that all the time. You tell me that all the time. And why as a parent do you keep telling your kids that? because you feel, whether accurate or not, they have heard it, but do not get it. Right? And that's why we continue to get instructed, because sometimes we think we get it. And then later on we go, oh, I didn't really get it before. And now I do. Because life and experience sometimes gives us insight to things we've been told. It's like kids. When you're told, brush your teeth in the morning, brush your teeth at night, you're like, oh, yeah, blah, blah. They're going to fall out in a few years anyway when you're little, right? But then the next one, you're trying to build a habit, right? For later. Because they don't really think about getting cavities. They don't think about all the costs and all of the pain and all of the things that are going to come years later for not doing it right and doing it well from young. And so they don't get the consequence. And then later on you get some cavities. You go, oh, okay. I not only have to brush my teeth, oh yeah, and the dentist is going to tell me, make sure you're flossing. Got to get it. And so why did he tell them so many times? We're going to look at actually each one of them. I want to look at them in a broader context of the whole section he's talking about. The cross. And taking up your cross and following Jesus. We know about Jesus' cross. You could really say the cross was Jesus' main purpose for why he walked upon this earth. He could have done essentially everything else as far as teaching people and instructing people except the cross without being in a human body. The cross was his purpose for being born. To proclaim and to free the captives. Us. So I want you to think, because we're going to look at in some coming weeks, trying to identify what is our cross. And actually, I do think one of the reasons that it became very popular to wear crosses or to hold crosses was because of these passages. It's like, because I think people struggle with figuring out what is our cross to bear. What is our cross that we need to pick up? And not only pick up once like Jesus did. Luke 9, in that particular section, he said pick it up daily. So our cross is something that's a little different than his. But it's still our purpose. I'm trying to figure out what that is. So let's look at Matthew chapter 10. Jesus had called his apostles, those who are going to be his apostles, the 12. He called to him the 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out, to heal every disease and every affliction. The names of the 12 apostles are first Simon, then Peter and Andrew and James and John and Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James and Thaddeus and Simon and Judas. And he wanted to send them out. And he's going to send them out and he's going to have them do some things. He's going to have them do some teaching, some preaching, some miracles. They're going to perform some miracles and things. And before he sends them out, he's going to give them some instructions. And so he starts in verse 5, instructing them and telling them, don't go to the Gentiles. This wasn't their time to go to the Gentiles. And, and don't go to the Samaritans. But we're just going to go to the Jews. And you're going to go there and you're just going to, you don't have to take, gold or silver because they need to support you. Now later on when he tells them they're going to go out into the world, he actually kind of reverses this. He says, you need to take an extra bill. You need to take extra stuff because you're going to go out in the world and they're not going to necessarily support you. But Israel was supposed to support these guys. They were being sent out by God, messengers from him. Their responsibility was to not only, by support, I mean, they come into a town, you take them in, you put them up, you feed them, you send them on their way with some money to get to the next place. So he goes out and tells them that. He tells them in verse 16, listen, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. He's not sending them out. This passage does not mean out in the world. He means amongst your brethren. Israel was full of wolves. He says, I'm going to send you out amongst wolves. You need to be wise. And understand that persecution's coming. And then he said, you really need to not be afraid. Can you imagine that? You tell them exactly what to be afraid of, and then tell them don't be afraid. Now, I think somebody was just talking about this recently when we're talking about fear, is when we say don't be afraid, what we really mean is to overcome the fear. Overcome the natural tendency to run away because this is scary. And he says, no, you need to stand up and do this, even though it's going to intimidate you. It will possibly scare you, but you need to overcome that. And so, don't be afraid. And then he goes on and he kind of tells them, starting in verse 34, listen, I need you to understand, you're not here to bring peace. You're here to bring a sword. And the sword really has two edges. Okay? I'm going to set people against one another. We are going to divide the people. We are going to go out into the people and we're going to say who wants to follow God and who doesn't. So then he goes on but I want to, in this part, he ends with, let me just pick it up in verse 36. A person's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Now, the other ones we can kind of understand. You can't love them more than me. And that's actually, I think, a very difficult challenge. It's very difficult to not love your child more than Jesus. It's very difficult to not love your family more than Jesus. But that's what he said. He says, that's the standard. You can't follow me if you don't love me more. And then he gives it, and he says, if you don't take up your cross, you're not worthy to come follow me. Now, I really suspect that they had a tough time with that line. Now, they knew what a cross was. Romans were crucifying people all the time. But I'm not sure they understood its context very well. Because could you imagine, just imagine that this whole chapter, all this red letters in chapter 10, you were standing there listening to it all. How much would you have grasped right after he spoke it to you? I don't know, little bits of it, bits and pieces, and you'd have gone, oh, okay, yeah. What did he say again? Fortunately, they sent 2 by 2 so they could go and they could ask, do you remember what he said about that thing? Oh yeah, that was good. And remind each other what he had said. But he instructed them that there was, and this is a big part of the dividing. Everybody likes the idea of God. Everybody, I think, in the world, if you're not just an avowed, just really a militant atheist, even agnostics like the idea of an eternal heaven, right? A glorious, wonderful place beyond. The problem is, not everybody who likes that idea gets it. And he said, those who get it, those who will receive that reward, have to follow me. And following me is hard. Right? I mean, in some ways, couldn't you sum that up? Following me is hard. and it's a challenge. And you have to think about whether you're really committed to doing it. So let's look at the next passage here, Matthew 16, because he actually kind of further explained it a little bit later. In chapter 16 of Matthew, he kind of writes for us again we don't know what point this is. This is the second time it's recorded in this book, this gospel anyway. But we'll start in verse 21. We're going to focus on verse 24 here. But he says, "From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day be raised." So think about that verse for a second. That's kind of that's the narrator, okay, telling us he began to start teaching them something. Well, what does that mean? To begin it means you didn't just do it once. It's something you started and you kept doing. And it tells us that Peter just didn't like this teaching, and Peter took him aside. Could you imagine being the person with enough guts to take the Messiah aside to correct him? That's Peter. So Peter took him aside, began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Can you imagine Peter? I don't imagine what his reaction to that was, being called Satan, thinking he's a hindrance. And he was trying to help, right? Thought he was doing something good, I'm sure. And he's telling, you're not doing something good. Have you ever had that where you thought you were doing something good and it ended up being bad? It just ended up the wrong thing. You thought you were trying to do something good. It's like, wow, that really backfired. And Peter did that here. And Jesus, why was he a hindrance to Jesus? Because Jesus didn't really want to be crucified, did he? The cross was his purpose. And yet, would any of us be looking forward to be nailed up to a wooden beam? No. That would be fearful, wouldn't it? We'd have to overcome the fear to allow ourselves to have that happen. Especially when we had the power to stop it. Because he has that. So, when you think about Jesus is telling him, listen, you're tempting me. That's why he's Satan. Satan is the tempter. You are tempting me to not do that. Do you remember back when Jesus first began his ministry and Satan took him out into the wilderness? You remember what one of those temptations was that Satan gave him? Look, I'll give you all the kingdoms to rule over if you just follow me. Jesus had to refuse that. Satan was tempting him. And Peter is tempting him. No, you don't need to die. You can just rule. No. I'm not going to rule here on earth. You're thinking about things in a human way. And I'm not here for you to think about it that way. And so he goes on. Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." And think about how that applied to Jesus. He lost his life, but not only saved it, right, by being raised up and ascending into heaven, but he also saved all of ours. But if he hadn't done that, if he had saved his life, we would have perished. We would face death. And so we have to do the same thing he had to do. We have to deny that which says, I want to do what I want to do in the flesh, in order to do that which God has purposed for me as a Christian. That's difficult. That's hard. And it takes real commitment, because are you ever persistent with anything you're not committed to? Now, I know I'm not. I mean, I struggle being persistent even if I am committed to it. If I'm not committed, it's just like, I might try it, but I'm not going to stick with it. If we're not committed, we're not going to make it. Because when it gets hard, we're going to be like some of the people we read in the scriptures that kind of go, well, I can't do this. This is too hard. So let's go to another passage here. But notice what he had said here. Well, I guess let me finish reading down through 28. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? See, that's the people who are just looking to get as much out of this life as possible. Which, by the way, if there was no life after this world, that would be the way to go. And I don't know, are you aware that Paul even teaches that? If there was nothing after this world, if there was no resurrection for you, you'd be better off getting as much as you can out of this world. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he said, if there's no resurrection, we, of all people, are the most pitiable. And so ultimately the answer is, do you believe there's something after this world? And that's the main reason Jesus was resurrected, to give us proof that he has power over death. That life does not end when your body stops breathing. And so he said, what shall a man give in return for his soul? What would you give? I always love the movies that are based upon the idea of was it Dante's Inferno, where they make the bargain with the devil, and the idea that, I want something, I'm going to make a bargain with the devil to give me this something, and it never obviously works out for that person, right? And he said, so people will give a lot sometimes to get the things they really desire. But what would you give for your very life, for your very soul? What would you give for having that soul be saved forever in heaven, in the garden of God that he has planted and he has made? If we really think about it, most of us would give a lot. The problem is, what we mean by a lot is, we'll give you a lot right now in this moment. You know what's even worse than just like paying a lot or giving somebody everything at one moment? Is giving somebody everything for every moment, for every day of the rest of your life. That's more difficult, isn't it, than paying a one-time big price. But that's the price of following Christ. So let's go on. Let's look at the next one. In Mark chapter 8. And we're starting at verse 31. And he couples this one with the idea of be careful of being ashamed. So in Mark 38, starting verse 31, he said, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, just like we saw in the other one, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly, and Peter took him aside, began to rebuke him. So we see this is probably the exact same account of that particular event. And turning, seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them. So now he's not just talking to the disciples, he calls a crowd to him. And he says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And so notice that he couples this idea of being ashamed of him and his words with the idea of picking up our cross. Well, doesn't that give an implication that we have to talk about him and his words? Because if I didn't have to ever mention him, if I never had to mention his words to anybody, it'd be easy just to kind of just pretend it's not there, and then nobody would ever, know anything about it, and you wouldn't say anything, and then you'd never feel ashamed. And there's an implication that as his follower, we're going to talk about our Lord. Because remember, as we've already read, he's the most important thing in the world to us. We love him more than our grandchildren, who are cuter than your grandchildren. We love him more than our children. We love him more than our parents, right? We don't brag on him like we brag on our grandchildren and our children and our family. Why don't we do that? Because nobody makes us ashamed of loving or even putting signs on our thing that said our grandchildren are cuter than your grandchildren. I saw that yesterday. Why it came to my mind. Nobody gets upset about that. But when you say, my Lord has given everything for you, and you need to follow him if you really want to be saved, whoa, wait a second, those are fighting words. So we don't say those. And we don't say we love him more than we love our kids. We don't say we love him more than we love our grandkids or our pet family. But why don't we do that? Written right there a whole bunch of times. And so, because it's really easy to feel a little bit ashamed by the world's reaction to being a Christian. So we get timid. And he says, you got to be careful of this, of being ashamed of me. Because if you're ashamed of me, I'm going to be ashamed of you when I come. And we certainly don't want him to be ashamed of us, right? When he comes. So let's look at the next one. And this is the passage we've already read. And we had it up there in Luke 9:23. This really is our theme verse for this quarter. So in Luke 9:23, again, we have a very similar situation. He is foretelling his death. In verse 21 and 22, he was strictly charging and commanding them to tell no one this, and saying the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed, and on the third day be raised. And he said to everyone, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life basically says the same thing as the last one. But now he says, this isn't just a one-time thing. This is a daily thing. See, and daily things are harder than because when you have to do something every day, that takes a great deal more commitment than doing some one big thing. See, a lot of times we want, and you ever notice that movies, the heroes are often people who do some big momentous thing in some moment, right? So we're like, okay, I might not always be there for you, each day, but boy, when the chips are really down, then I'll be there for you. Well, does that really happen? People who aren't there for you each day, are they there for you in the bit when it really hits it? Typically not. Because why do soldiers who become heroes, why do they become heroes? In those moments, those big things, some big battle, saving somebody's life, or dragging, because they were doing their job every day and every hour all along. And then they just happened to be in that one spot, in that one moment, and they did their job. That's why when you hear, especially soldiers talk about being called heroes, almost universally they say I was just doing my job. Because that's what they were doing it, just like they did it every other time. And they'd trained for that moment, and they just did it. Because that's what real heroes look like. Somebody who does their job all the time. And when the big tough moment happens, they continue to do their job. And that's what Jesus is talking about for us. Are we going to do our job? Are we going to pick up our cross every day and do our job? Figure out, what is that job? That's going to be the hard part, I think. Something even for me, that as I think about all the different things in Scripture where he talks about we need to do, there's a lot. There's a lot of things we ought to be doing as Christians. So let's look over in Luke 14. And in this passage, this is actually a passage I read a lot to, especially to people I've taught or get ready to baptize, or one of the last passages I usually teach before somebody wants to be baptized. And that is because he talks about this idea of a cost. Yeah, you want to follow him, and that's great, but he wants to tell you, he advises you, there's a cost to it. And so in Luke 14, we're starting verse 25, he says, great crowds accompanied him. He turned and said to them. So now, this is not with his disciples and just maybe a few other people. He's got great crowds. So there's a lot of people. They're following him. And they're probably following him because of the miracles he's done, the feeding of people he's done, all the different things that they've heard about and seen, and they want to see themselves. And now he turns around and he says, and what he does here is he actually drives most of them away with what he talks about. And he says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. How many people do you think would leave at that moment? Probably a lot. Now notice in all the other Gospels, he didn't say hate. In this particular moment, he was being a little bit more confrontational. He said, in the other passages, he usually said, you've got to love me more. But here he says, listen, you got to hate them, and even your own life. Now, does he literally mean that? Not really, because we're to love one another, right? We're to love our neighbor, to love our family. But he's making a point. In comparison to loving him, it's like you hate everybody else. And he says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. He didn't say things like, well, you're not worthy of me, because you might almost make the idea that, well, I'm not worthy. Of course I'm not worthy of you. I mean, couldn't we all say that? We're not worthy of him. But here he's saying really much more plainly, listen, you're not going to be my disciple. You don't pick up your cross. You might love the idea of God. You might even love the idea of me. You might even know you're a sinner. You don't pick up your cross, you're not mine. Wow. That's kind of blunt, isn't it? That's kind of harsh. And he was being harsh, and it drove a lot of the crowd away. He was being too hard for a lot of them to take. He says, for which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? See, we don't start building a house if we know we have just enough money for a foundation. We have to make sure we have enough money, usually not enough money of our own. Usually it's our own plus some loan from a bank. But can we afford to build or buy this house? And you don't start the process until you know you have it all. And that's what he's kind of talking about in terms of following him. You need to not only know the parts where he says, I love you, I want to be with you, I want to care for you, I want to give you my grace, I want to give you my peace, all the wonderful stuff that he promises, but you got to know the hard stuff too. There's a lot of wonderful stuff, a lot of great stuff. There's a lot of hard stuff. Now, this world is the problem. Because being godly and being like Christ in a world that killed him means it's not going to like us either when we're like him. At least often. And so the cost to follow him is everything. I mean, giving up everything we are. In fact, notice going all the way down to verse 33. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Ooh, doesn't that actually, I don't know about you, doesn't that actually feel like that's too much? Doesn't that almost feel too hard? That's like sobering, isn't it? I know it is to me. It's like, that seems really harsh. And that seems really hard. And that seems big. But I want to, as we end with this passage, which we started looking at this last Wednesday in Matthew 5:13-16. And after I read it, kind of explain my thinking here. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So he brings up 2 points here near the beginning of his sermon when he went on the mountain. And he says salt. If salt isn't salty, what's it good for? It only really has one purpose. And if if it's not worth it, you just throw it out. What about light? And I was thinking about this. I think a really great example for us, which is different from there because we have electricity. We plug lights into the walls. What do you have? Anybody keep around bulbs that don't light anymore? Other than the CFL ones, which I hate because you can't get rid of those things anywhere except a special hazmat place. Need hazmat suits to get rid of old fluorescent bulbs. But we don't keep around a light bulb that goes out, right? Because what's the purpose of the light bulb? Well, it's a decoration. Not really. It has no other purpose. And so when it's not lit, you throw it away. And you don't light a bulb and then cover it up, do you? Now for us, we would know you're going to set the house on fire. But you don't light a bulb to cover it. Likewise, we are not made Christians to be like we used to be. We are not made to be Christians to live a life that I desired long ago. I'm a Christian to live like a Christian. We need to do what we are. If we are a Christian, we need to do the things Christians do. Ephesians chapter 2 even tells us in verse 10 that we were created in Christ Jesus for good works. Figuring out what those works are that we can do is something that is really necessary for us to practice what we believe, to be who we are, to not just be pretending, to not be acting, right? What's the scriptural word for acting like a Christian? The word hypocrite. The word hypocrite in Scripture actually is the word used for acting. So when somebody's acting in a play or in a movie, we understand it, right? We don't expect the person who's murdering somebody in a movie to really, in real life, be a murderer. They're acting for a story. But when they're outside the story, we don't want them to be acting. We don't want our friends to be acting like they're a friend. We want them to be a real friend. We don't want, people around acting like they're Christians. We want to be Christians. And that's what he's talking about, that we can do as well. So next week, we're going to begin to look at identifying our cross. And I think there's a lot of them. by the way. A lot of different things that are our purpose. And each one of us might be in different circumstances. And each one of us, our cross may be a little different than his. Obviously, all of ours is different than his because none of us is going to be nailed to a cross to save the souls of the whole world. But each one of us has a cross. We have to bear our own cross, identifying what is our cross, figuring out how can we endure it, and how can we pick it up every day and do what we are.